challenges that we are facing and the role of evaluation. The second gave us very interesting insights in terms of different experiences of our member countries. And we heard from our colleagues from Paraguay, from the DRC, from North Macedonia and the Solomon Islands, and the challenges they faced in terms of establishing their monitoring and evaluation systems. So in this session, we are continuing to unpack these issues for national evaluation systems development. And I would like to first introduce you to our speakers. They are, and our order is a little bit switched around. So first, let me introduce Candice Morkel, who is third from me. Candice is the director of the Clear Anglophone Africa office, part of the Global Evaluation Initiative. She's also a senior lecturer in monitoring and evaluation at Wits University in South Africa. Next, let me introduce Osvaldo Nestor Feinstein. Osvaldo, immediately to my left, is a development evaluator and economist. He's a professor at the Master in Evaluation at the Madrid Complutense University, and he's a member, which we're very pleased of, for the International Evaluation Advisory Panel of UNDP's Independent Evaluation Office. I've had the pleasure of working with Osvaldo for many years, and I'm thrilled that he's with us on this panel. We have Sarah Clear, who is all the way to the far left. She is with the German Institute for Development Evaluation, DEVAL, and a team leader for the FOCALAC Plus project. And we very much appreciate that she's here, together with her colleague and deputy director for the DEVAL Evaluation Office, Sven Harten. And we are very pleased that we have all of you here to make presentations. We have asked our panelists to work with us on three important questions. First of all, what is holding back the development of national evaluation systems? Second, where are the capacity traps and the vicious as well as virtuous cycles that explain the setbacks that we faced in our national evaluation systems development? And third, how can conceptual frameworks and systems approaches help us to identify the gaps and accelerate the establishment of national evaluation systems? Now, we are going to have three presentations with several slides each. I'm then going to ask Sven to also provide some of his thoughts more informally. And then we are going to create time for all of you to consider questions that you'd like to raise with the panelists. I was very pleased at the second plenary today, how eager there was amongst us to ask questions. Please continue that enthusiasm so that we have a very good discussion as part of this session. With those very brief words in mind, let me first ask Candice to join us and make her presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Alan, and I am so grateful to have the opportunity to talk to you today. I hope we're going to have an exciting conversation, and thank you for choosing this session. So I have a confession to make. I rehearsed my slides over and over again, but just could not fit the third question into the time slot. So I will ask your indulgence that I focus on the very, very important points on the first two questions, and then hopefully in the Q&A we can talk about the third question. So while they are, there we go. Okay, they're sorting. That's my one. Perfect. Is it coming up? Okay, just a second. So I was actually quite challenged by the first question, because the first question asks why the national evaluation systems have been held back, or what is holding back national evaluation systems? And I had to think quite deeply about this, because from our experience, there's been quite a high demand for strengthening national evaluation systems and quite a strong appetite for developing, even developing new national evaluation systems. But on deeper reflection, I concurred that these systems are indeed being held back from what they could potentially be. So sometimes, even though the systems are in place, or elements of the systems are in place, what is being held back is what they could potentially be in taking the agenda forward towards achieving the impact that we need to achieve. So there's a bit of what we call instrumentalism in public administration, where something is there, the structure, the function is there, but it's not really making a huge impact. And of the 6 areas that are on the slide, I'd like to focus really on the first 3, because the last 3, well, if I want to simplify it, we need to do those better. But on integration, evaluation findings really find their way into the policy and budget decision-making system. There's often a separation between policy, planning, and monitoring and evaluation. And so you'll often find that there's a policy unit, there's a planning unit, there's an M&E unit, and the 3 don't really speak to each other, and they have different processes of either producing evidence and using it for whatever purpose or mandate that they actually have. And so M&E is also often seen as an accountability tool rather than supporting policy and program decision-making. And in many administrations, what we have seen is that ministries of finance or treasuries remain primarily responsible for fiscal planning and budgeting, which they do with little or no serious engagement with the entities responsible for monitoring and evaluation. Now, I know we talk mostly about evaluation, but in the countries where we work, particularly Anglophone Africa, monitoring and evaluation is a mandate and a remit that governments have together. So the administrative systems and the systems to gather data for tracking progress are seen as part and parcel of needing to develop the evaluation systems as well. So yes, there is, the framing of evaluation systems, but many governments have these positioned as one function, and we normally talk about monitoring and evaluation. On the issue of the monitoring and evaluation market, so the wording of supply and demand chain is rather inadequate to describe the complexity of the evaluation capacity development landscape. So it's not a linear cause and effect chain. So very often you'll find that the narrative is articulated as a problem of supply. We can't find enough really good evaluators, really good local evaluators. And therefore we've got to have international evaluators flown in to do the work. And the local people are used for, data collection or, gatekeepers opening the doors to gain access to spaces where the data can be collected. But in effect, there's also another narrative, which is there's a poor quality of evaluation in terms of reference, which is a common refrain as well. There are many other layers to this issue of the mismatch between supply and demand, and maybe we'll get to talk about it a little bit later when we talk about the capacity traps and the vicious and virtuous cycles. But I think this is what evaluation capacity development tries to do. It's trying to remedy this problem of this mismatch between supply and demand. And I think that there's a false perception or assumption that once we get the supply right, all of our evaluation problems will be resolved. And I think that that's a bit of a misconception on our side. And then just lastly on this slide on the enabling environments. So we move from the premise that laws, policies, and regulations are a very important element of strengthening national evaluation systems, especially in contexts where political and administrative changes can really affect the evaluation function. So what we've seen is evaluation functions are promoted to ministries, and political shifts and changes happen, and then they're demoted to secretariats or departments. And so the champions that you had driving a particular agenda to strengthen the system, suddenly they no longer have agency. So It's not the only thing, but it's a very, very strong lever to actually have policies and laws and regulations to ensure the sustaining or the durability of the national evaluation system. I think there's a slide that is missing from this one, but I'll talk to it. One back, just before the capacity traps. This is a very, very important one, and I won't go into too much detail. But what it's basically saying is that we mustn't forget about the historical antecedents of how the practice of evaluation manifests in the development sector in the global south. So particularly in poorer nations, we're finding that there are recent calls for transforming and decolonizing evaluation. And I want to talk a bit about how these are linked to possibly why we're having problems with sustaining really robust national evaluation systems. So across the African continent, we can trace a thread between national accountability and reporting systems and the history of colonialism that was centered around domination and the facilitation of extraction, and how that found its way into public policy, and dare I say, new public management, new public administration. For those who are public administrators, you might know that some of the onerous requirements linked to new public management found its way into how bureaucracies and administrations are actually shaped across the African continent currently. And this has entrenched a certain kind of thinking about monitoring and evaluation, which is not grounded in localized indigenous ways of being and doing. So whilst work is being done to change this, for example, there is a body called the International Evaluation Academy. In fact, I sit on that academy with Osvaldo as well, and Professor Ian Goldman, Professor Bagela Chilisa, Michael Quinn-Patton, and a number of people who are very serious about transformation. This is what is capturing our attention currently, to say, how do we transform evaluation so that it speaks better to localized needs and has a more indigenized approach to developing national evaluation systems and the production and use of evidence. So we need to think about evaluation in the broader context of the development industry and the power relations that determine whom it benefits and whom it does not benefit, whom it is done on behalf of, and who the subjects of evaluations are. So according to Professor Chilisa and colleagues, I mean, this is quite a controversial statement. Chilisa and colleagues wrote this paper, and they say very dramatic statement: in developing countries, evaluation has become the worst instrument of epistemological imperialism. So you might agree with that, you might disagree, maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A session. But judgments about what constitutes good evidence and the means of acquiring that evidence are often based on marginalizing judgments about the world. So these have severe consequences for what gets measured and what is valued and how accountability is derived. And so the othering of non-Western nations and the problem of misrecognition in international aid illustrates how recipient countries are often not viewed as equal partners in the system. And then they are rendered invisible and ignored as valid agents of knowledge production. And, I can talk some more about it in the Q&A, but it's also about who is driving the evaluation agenda in some countries. And so on this second question of capacity development, just going straight now into the question around capacity traps and the vicious or virtuous circles. Maybe I focus too much on the vicious circles, but there is I actually want to revise this first statement. I initially said that there's a misconception that capacity development is only training, but I think there's a bit of a disconsciousness about it. And what I mean by disconsciousness is that we rather, accept the status quo as is. We accept the existing order of things as a given, that, we can't manage to do capacity development in any other way. It's too costly, it takes too much time, and therefore we'll just rely on training alone. So you'll find that ECD programs that address all elements of the national evaluation system ecosystem are quite rare, but you do have some actors who are trying to do work in this space. The GEI, for example, is one of them. The entire premise of the GEI is to look at evaluation systems from a systems perspective and have ECD not focusing only on training, but on the enabling environment, policies, laws, regulations, and also shepherding and leadership of the system as well. As I said earlier, we have an incomplete understanding of the problem and the ECD market. And so I think because we don't have a good idea of what's actually happening and what the problem is, we rely on the tools that we've always used, which is training. And I think we really, as a sector, need to do a lot more work, a lot more empirical work to understand the landscape of ECD. Where are the real problems? Where are the real challenges? Is it truly about supply? Is it truly that commissioners are not commissioning evaluations properly? Or are there some of these deeper problems that I've reflected on earlier on? There's also a gap between ECD and local evidence use systems. So what do I mean by that? So when I look at the curriculum of many ECD programs, I'm talking about the training, the teaching and learning component. They're often not aligned to what's happening in the actual policy environment or decision-making environment in the local context. And so what happens is, people whom you train, especially in government, you give them all these theoretical, perfect ideas around how theories of change are supposed to work and how when you produce evidence, all of a sudden decision makers will be very happy about it. But then they go back to the environment, which is very difficult to actually apply those. So what I do think is that we are not focusing enough on what the local context is saying and what the needs are to the actual ECD interventions that we are building. And I know that I'm probably out of time. Is it still enough time to do 2 more points? Okay, just 2 more points. So I work in a university. Our center, which is Clear Anglophone Africa, is actually hosted by a research-intensive university. It's one of the top universities on the continent, which is amazing for legitimacy. So when we work in this space, a lot of our partners across the continent were like, yes, we know Wits University. We really believe in your education programs. We want to be trained by you. But because it is an academic institution and a high-profile one, it also expects that we comply with a lot of the requirements for, what academia wants to see. And it's not only our university, but many other academic institutions, not only in our country, but other Anglophone African countries as well, where the academic program for evaluation sits so far apart and is on a parallel track to the discussions we're having here, for example, on complexity and evaluation systems being more than just supplying evidence for decision making. So what's happening is that when people are either going to their formal academic programs in evaluation or the short courses, they're not really speaking to what's happening, what the real need or what the reality is in the context of evaluation practice. And I do think that we need to do a lot more thinking for those of us who are ECD providers to talk about systems in our curriculum. Because why are we teaching theory of change as the linear box and sausage machine of in and out? Why have we not? So we teach it that way, but then when people get into practice, they realize, oh, it's a lot more complex than this. And we don't spend enough time. We might say something about, oh, it is a lot more complex than this, but we don't really get deeply into it. So I do think that on our ECD side of things, we've not really spoken about, we've not taken a systems perspective on ECD interventions. And then finally, there's the decades-long problem of the slow progress in professionalization. Now, I don't know about you, but certainly for me, I've been in this for a long time, and it ebbs and flows through phases. So sometimes it becomes really a hot topic and everybody wants to jump on it. And then people start asking difficult questions and everybody gets quiet and nothing happens for a couple of years. And then it starts, people start asking questions again, especially new entrants into the field and our young and emerging evaluators. They are wanting to know, what is the development path for me to become a professional evaluator? And it is very unclear. So I think we need to take a decision around because there's a proliferation of ECD interventions out there. And here I'm talking specifically about training, but there isn't a good semblance of what all of this leads to. What combination of things do I need to know to turn me into a professional evaluation practitioner? And again, it's not only evaluators, because you may be a commissioner, you may be a user of evidence. So where do we make the space in the room, create the room for different kinds of professionals in evaluation? And so I think that this is where I stopped, because I was totally out of time when I rehearsed. And there is a slide on conceptual frameworks, but I also know that my colleague Sarah is really going to dig deeply into frameworks, and I'll be happy to answer questions around that when my turn comes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Candice. There is so much to unpack from your presentation, and I know we will have some time during the Q&A to do so, so please keep that in mind. And but I will have to say that I was struck by one very important point, and that is, we as evaluators are in the job of telling others where they are succeeding and where they are having challenges. And when we have colleagues who have indicated that evaluation has become the worst instrument of epistemological imperialism, then we have to look in the mirror and think about these types of statements. And we need to think about the othering of non-Western nations, because these are real issues, these are real concerns, and I appreciate very much, Candice, that you raised them. So I hope as we go through this discussion during not only this session here, but also in the couple of days ahead, we keep in mind that we do have to have a very direct and honest discussion with ourselves sometimes about the work that we do. The next up, I would like to have Osvaldo Feinstein go ahead and make his presentation, and he'll do so from the chair. Can you hear? Yes. You have both, so whichever one.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for your kind words, and thanks for the invitation by IEO. For me, it's a pleasure to be with you. I will be sitting at the same level because we are all at the same level in a way. After several decades working in this area, I think that we have to be humble enough to recognize that there have been progress, but also some great progress is to be done. Listening to Candice, I was recalling discussions that we had 20, 30 years ago about what comes first, demand or supply. And at that time, people argue exactly in the opposite way, that demand comes first. And because we don't have demand, that is the reason why we don't have supply. And that was called the ECD conundrum. Then I realized, after some time, I will be addressing the three questions that our astute moderator posed to us at the end. And I will try to do it after presenting a few slides to lay the ground for that. But one of the things that I realized is that ECD is a very tricky acronym. Evaluation capacity development. But indeed, as in the conference, we have NEC as national evaluation capacities. It's very important to go from the singular to the plural. As this morning, Oscar Garcia mentioned the different type of capacities, and also Candice made a reference, commissioning, managing, conducting evaluations, and using evaluations. And for a long time, we were speaking, writing, and working on ECD. And that became a problem. And I realized then that it was very important to develop a conceptual framework. You see? I'm making some distinctions between the different functions, unpacking, managing, conducting, using. You can increase the, for example, commissioning can be included also there. But the important thing is to avoid retaining the singular. Then the principals and agents, government, but also civil society, think tanks, that are much more in the sense of conducting evaluations, universities. And finally, embedding this in supply and demand. It is true, as Candice pointed out, that it's a limited framework, but if you enlarge the framework using potential supply, potential demand, latent supply, then it can give you a much better grasp of the situation. And having this simple, but hopefully not simplistic framework, you can put it in terms of a conceptual scheme in the metrics. Sometimes some people, myself included, see things more clearly through metrics. And for example, the diagonal is one possibility to look in terms of the diagnostic. Government managing evaluations or commissioning evaluations, university think tanks, consultants conducting evaluations, and parliament using evaluations. On this, there is a lot of progress to be made, but there have been some important advances. In fact, I saw here Ada Ocampo, the president of IDEAS, and IDEAS has done some very important work in terms of trying to involve parliamentarians in using evaluations. Because this is a way of dealing with the demand issue. And with this type of conceptual scheme and others that have been mentioned today and will be developed during the following days, like MESA, the monitoring and evaluation system analysis, we don't have still MES, which would be monitoring and evaluation system synthesis. Perhaps some people would be scared to call it MES because of messy. But anyway, then we can have these elements for the diagnosis, and then on that basis to identify the key constraints that can suggest lines of action in terms of which type of constraint has the critical role, including the possibility of South-South cooperation, South in the figurative sense that Mexico is a country in the South. But Mexico has some very important experiences in social policies, so it's interesting to have it there. And in fact, it has provided assistance to South Africa in the development of their system. And we can develop some tentative lessons learned. Tentative in the sense of hypothesis. We can never be absolutely sure, like in science with hypotheses. But these are four that I think are important. The second one is related to what Candice mentioned. And you can look at this in terms of possibilities of having training without development of national capacities, which may seem paradoxical, but has happened in countries where some people were trained and then they migrated, they became staff of international organizations, some of my former colleagues, which is great for them, but the country's capacities were diminished because of that. So this shows that it's not sufficient, it's not necessary, because you can have capacities in the country that have not been used for evaluation. I had experiences in Mozambique from all countries where several people were very competent in doing evaluations, but they were not involved in the task. So it's not necessary nor sufficient. And now, in the final 2 minutes, I will address the questions of our astute moderator. And I will propose 2 answers for each of the questions. But of course, there are more answers, as Candice elaborated, and most likely Sarah will also mention. But the first one has to do with demand, the limited awareness of the role of evaluation. This was mentioned in a way today by Alison Evans, when she referred to the policymakers and the lack of ownership. And it's very important to have this type of awareness of what evaluation can provide. And the second is the lack of a conceptual framework. And that's the reason why I started by that, which is related to supply. In terms of capacity traps, I think that one that we, in a way, mentioned in passing has to do with the perception of lack of capacities in the country. And then there are no opportunities to do evaluations, and therefore there's no learning by doing. So this, in a way, replicates itself, even though sometimes there may be capacities, as I was mentioning in the case of Mozambique. And of course, in other countries, the situation is even much better. And second, the belief in universal best practices. It's not that one cannot learn from other experiences, but one has to be careful because of what we call in evaluation external validity, which sometimes is limited. And one has to be very concerned that in some cases, we may be just becoming part of the problem if some practices are extrapolated and the context is different. So the problem is with simplistic, not simple, but simplistic approach. And finally, in terms of what can be the contribution of this framework, as you can imagine at this stage of the presentation, I see it as a contribution to the diagnosis, identifying capacity constraints, and therefore in developing an appropriate strategy, not just on the basis of first principles, but in terms of the constraints that were identified as key constraints. So thank you for your attention, and I think we are on time.
Osvaldo, thank you. I have to say, as a point of reference, my appreciation for Osvaldo's work, because as a member of our evaluation advisory panel over the years, is so often because he presents in a clear way very complex issues. And we know in our business, sometimes people speak and make it more complicated. But our effort really needs to be, how do we simplify and indicate the key points? And I, again, took away so much from what also Osvaldo has just indicated, I'm sure you have as well, the importance of differentiating stakeholders and how we engage with them, the need to make sure that training people is not the same thing as improving the institutional capabilities where we work. And of course, so many other aspects. Now, please, can we turn our attention and ask Sarah to come up and continue this discussion and really get into some of the systems related issues as well.
Yeah, we don't see what's there. At least one few of the slide is on the.
Thank you. That's if we can get some assistance on that.
The problem is give me the solution. I don't know a simple solution, and I hate to do it. Is could you move slightly to one side, and then we will work on the projection.
Okay, so you see, good afternoon from my part. Thank you very much, Candice. Thank you very much, Osvaldo, for your very interesting presentations. I will try to do the same as Osvaldo did. Actually, I already learned a lot from him. I will try to make a complicated issue not more complicated, at least. So the question we want to talk about today is what is holding back the development of national evaluation systems? At DeVal, we were discussing this question a lot. We are working in, well, ECD is one of our core areas of work. And we were always convinced that we need to address the whole evaluation system whenever we are working in ECD. So as Osvaldo and also Candice said, we were convinced that we need to work with those who commission evaluation, with those who are implementing evaluations, and with those who use evaluations. And then one day we were like, okay, so when we are so convinced of the national evaluation system as such, we have to learn more about a system. What is a system? How does a system work? That might help us answering the question of what is holding back the development of national evaluation systems. And it took us months to do so. And I will try to to explain that in 5 minutes to you. So let's think about what is a system. We are a system. Alison Evans this morning mentioned we are part of a global evaluation system, and we are. Then yesterday, I was part of a victim of the European train system, trying to make my way from Cologne via Paris to Turin. And I guess you were also part of a travel system. Who of you had a delay in your travel to Turin? So what is holding back the development of travel systems might be another question, as we see here. Then who of you took an elevator this morning? I'm the only one? Okay. And an elevator is a good, whenever you step into an elevator, you notice you become part of a system if there are already other people in the elevator. You step inside, and the moment you step inside and there are other people, you turn around because it's awkward to face the other people, or you look at the floor. At least this is what you do in most parts of Europe. So you kind of notice you're part of a system. You don't always notice that. So an elevator is a system. Then an IT system, of course, well, when thinking of systems, we all think of IT systems. The universe is a system. A plant is a system. Our body is a system. And there are national evaluation systems. So not surprisingly, it does not exist, this systems theory. There is not a systems theory. But what does exist is, or those who are working a lot with systems theory, they are convinced that all systems, no matter which, they share the same features. There are some things that are true for all systems. And what we did was we applied these features that are true for each and every system to national evaluation systems. And then we thought about, so what does that tell us for ECD? And I'll give you one example. So here you see the characteristics, let's call them characteristics of a system. You see, and hopefully you don't really see them. Don't bother yourself with reading them. It's not, well, you need to know more about than just reading them. So don't bother yourself with reading what's in those circles, but those are the features that you can apply to each and every system. And one of that is complementarity, just to make one example of what we did. Complementarity says that each new perspective on a system adds important information. However, it can be challenging to accept the existence of different and potentially conflicting truth. True for every system. For example, I just said that the body is a system. And perhaps some of you had dessert after lunch. And you might have noticed, okay, there are conflicting perspectives on that dessert. There's that one part who says, go help yourself, take that chocolate cake. The sugar will do you good. Sugar is important for the body. And then there are other parts of your body saying, no, don't eat that. So it's really easy to understand what complementarity is, I think, when you think of the body. Then what is complementarity when you think of a national evaluation system? We work a lot in Costa Rica. So what we saw there, and I guess this is what you can see everywhere else, is there was that government entity who wants to evaluate a social policy, which is good. And they said, okay, we want to evaluate this very important social policy, and we need the evaluation results by March, because this is when our new planning cycle starts. We need the evaluation to be done in a short period of time. Otherwise, it's not of much worse. This is a perspective I think many of us would think it's a good one. But then there's another perspective on the same evaluation that might, the evaluators, you say, it's a very important social policy. It's very complex. We can't evaluate it in a short period of time. If you want it to be an evaluation of high quality, we need more time. I'm an evaluator. I completely agree with this perspective. If you want to have a good evaluation, it needs to be of high quality, but then it's conflicting with the first perspective I said, which is also part of the national evaluation system. And then you have other parts. For example, civil society representatives might say, this social policy you want to evaluate, this is what is supposed to benefit us. We have to be part of this evaluation. We should be part of those who plan this evaluation. We should be part of the evaluation itself, discuss results with you. So you need to rethink your evaluation framework, your evaluation design. Again, a valid perspective. So here we have three parts of an evaluation system who have different perspectives, and each and every one is valid, is a good one, is an important one. So what did we do with this? We thought, okay, so we have those different parts of a system, and each part is important. We have to bring them together. And what we did in Costa Rica is we established a national evaluation platform, which brings together the whole evaluation system, well, the whole evaluation system, representatives from each part of the evaluation system. They meet on a regular basis and they discuss major decisions on the national evaluation system. For example, together, all those people together decided to develop a national evaluation policy. Together, they developed this national evaluation policy, and together they monitor this policy and the work plan behind the policy. So this is one example out of many of how we applied a feature, which is true for every system, to a national evaluation system, and then took a conclusion for our work. And this also covers a lot of what Osvaldo and Candace said before. And one very important remark from Candace, what Alan just mentioned too, that evaluation is the worst instrument of imperialism. For us as ECD practitioners, I'm myself from Germany, some part of our team is from Costa Rica. We are only one part of the evaluation system when we apply a system focus. And that's not that easy to apply in developing cooperation. So 5 minutes or a little more I hope you gathered this complex idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. You know, I was thinking about this issue of complementarity, and one of the issues that we all experience as evaluators, and that is this continuum between how much time we have, how much money we have, what is the opportunity for our evaluation to make a difference, and what's the quality that we can achieve with all those elements. And I think that complementarity issue rings for all of us, because we're always stuck in this question of what's good enough, and can we move fast enough to actually put our information to the persons who need it at the time that they can use it to make a difference. And so very, very important part of the systems equation for all of us. I'd like to turn now to Sven, and I have asked him not only to think about these issues in terms of the challenges that we face with national evaluation systems, but also to reflect a little bit on what can the donor community provide? What should be our expectation in terms of the kind of support that we should be asking for and receiving in our different countries in terms of the establishment and development of national evaluation systems? Now, I know that puts him a little bit on the spot coming from the German government, but I think we also have to have that discussion too, in light of some of the national evaluation systems discussions we've been having. What should be our expectations, and how should we engage in that way? So Sven, if I could just turn it to you to give some observations and perhaps a little bit of reflection on that question.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks, esteemed colleagues here in the room. First of all, Chatham House rules for what I'm going to say now, because to some extent it's going to be that look into the mirror that you referred to, trying to respond a bit to what Candice and Osvaldo said. So please don't ruin my career by quoting what I'm gonna say now. But when I was reflecting on what is holding us back, and also sort of the flip side of the coin, what can we do better? I mean, I worked for the European Commission, for the World Bank, and now for the German government. So a good deal of my career has been with international donors, with Western donors. Obviously, I can't speak for those organizations. So just a personal view in the mirror. When I started, so what is holding us back? When I started with my first ECD assignment about 22 years ago, roughly, in Bolivia, first thing, arrogance. I thought going there, not an old white guy from the north, as I'm now a young guy from the north, I could tell them how to improve their evaluation system in one of the Bolivian ministries. Having this old model of Western, Northern male experts in mind. So I think, at least for me, until I spent a couple of weeks in that place when the arrogance was quickly gone. But I started out quite arrogant. Secondly, what is holding us back as donors? Egoism, egocentric behavior. Germany has been putting a lot of emphasis on unilateral, bilateral development cooperation in the past. I mean, the Paris Declaration 2005 and Accra Agenda 2008 notwithstanding, in recent years, we've been seeing a trend to more bilateral cooperation and less focus on multilateralism. And combined that actually with, perhaps evaluation for a guy like me, until recently, was one of the few fields left where from the West, from the donor country, you could legitimately go to partner countries and say, hey, now let's evaluate what we've been doing. But evaluation is a core task of that donor. So being really egoistic about that. I learned my lesson through the work in Costa Rica to some extent. Third, and it's only 4 points, so I'm not going to bore you too much. Narrow-mindedness or naivete, in the sense that, and Candice, you alluded to it as well, Osvaldo as well. ECD, for me, for a long time in the beginning, equal training. You do training, capacity development, all done. So quite a narrow-minded perspective, quite naive. We now know that it's much more. But there, actually, I'm wondering, Candice and other fellow panelists who mentioned this, how do you move away from training? Because it's so easy, it's so convenient. You count the results. You can even measure behavior change if you're really ambitious. But how do you move away from that? Fourth point. We as evaluators, and I confess, I can be quite good at that as well. We have this hot air syndrome. I don't think there's any sort of academically, scientifically linked professional community who are so adept in using concepts that they heard 30 seconds before and use them as scholars has been working on that for 20 years. And in that sense, I'm really grateful for Sarah's article and we're working together and I need to make some promotion. I think this is a first serious attempt to use systems theory and really think through what it means for us as evaluators, because I've been using systems thinking, system theory, systems, whatever, systemic approach is a good one. I've been using it, and I don't think I ever really understood what it meant until I started working with Sarah on the article. So, you know, it's great to be eclectic. It's great to be, you know, in a community with different professions. But sometimes I feel we go a bit too far. So the good thing is, you know, for all those 4 points, there's a flip side, you know, and I'm an optimist. So I believe that here we can also start changing, and there is a legitimate role for us, and we can fulfill it. And it's quite easy. The first one is to be humble as donors, as evaluators, and to understand that you know, country-led evaluations, local perspectives, communities, indigenous views. This is probably the most precious source of information for us. And Candice, you're absolutely right. We have that epistemological problem here with sort of hardwired quantitative data being set as the gold standard. I think we still need that, but we need to combine it. But being humble about what we can achieve also through capacity development. The second one, altruism. You know, from a donor's perspective, it's quite tempting to say, "Oh, let's go to Cote d'Ivoire, you know, and let's do some great capacity development there, and then just, you know, tunnel and forget about what other partners are doing there." It's quite hard to say, okay, let's step back. Let's UNDP do it. Let other partners do it. We need to learn to work better as communities because we share the same goal. And then the other 2 points, really being more pragmatic, understanding what the demands are, and not sort of shifting quickly to training as sort of the tool of choice. And last but not least, the professionalism that we should take serious. So in that sense, esteemed colleagues, you know, Sarah, I would be really interested, perhaps later on in the discussion, how do you see, you know, the work you did in the article on systems theory and applying it? Can that be an entry point to ECD? And how does it actually fit with all those other analytical tools? Osvaldo has done some great work on that. There's the MESA tool, there's the INSEE, UNICEF has one. So how does it fit, and how do we start with analytical tools? Perhaps Osvaldo, that's a point for you as well. Candice, I was really intrigued about the training and how we can move forward from that. And Osvaldo, I mean, you know, it's a true honor to be with you here on the panel. So in your decades of experience, how do you tackle that point what you talked about the illusion of transferability? How can we learn from one country experience and apply it in another? So just some reflections, and thank you, Alan. I hope that wasn't too long.
No, Sven, thank you. You made my life much easier by already posing some questions to our team, because I'm going to ask them to respond to the questions that he just raised, which gives our audience a chance to think of questions as well, because after they've gone this first round, we're going to then ask you to raise some questions, and we'll do the usual. We'll ask 3 questions, ask them to respond, and then move to the next 3. We have 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. We started a little bit late, so we have, I think, a bit of time to have some participation. And Sven, I think you raised some interesting points for us, not only this look in the mirror, but also the idea that we immediately think that we are experts as soon as we hear a new idea and we want to apply it. And of course, we're not the only ones that have that difficulty. I was thinking of Osvaldo's comment about that systems theory is, we've had this recycled discussion for 20, 30 years. And those of us who have been in this business for a while see a number of issues that come up over and over again. My own organization is enamored with innovation and taking a portfolio approach. And they're asking us to evaluate these things. And you stop and say, well, we've been talking about innovation for decades, and we've been talking about outcomes and portfolios for quite a long time. So what's new in these issues? So we always have those challenges of what ground we're breaking. Colleagues, let me turn it to you. Sven had asked some very interesting questions in terms of how do we move on from training? How do we take that next step? And also, what are the entry points as we talk about systems design? Can I ask, and please, the first that nods their head, we will give you the mic. So Candice, you're up first. Yeah, I think it's better than.
Yeah, I do think so. Thank you so much. That question, Sven, is a really difficult one because I think we are so constrained by time and resources, and we know that taking on any kind of, let's say a mentorship or experiential approach to training adds on time. You need more facilitators. Like if it's a mentorship that you're adding on, you need mentors who are going to invest their time to mentor after the training component has been completed. If you're having a work immersion program, you have to have somewhere where that person can be absorbed into a system for a particular period of time so that they can get on the job experience. And all of that, I think, because it's not necessarily a must do, there isn't consensus that this must be part of ECD. I think it's now become something that's a novelty, or, depending on the institution, they will do it as something as, a novelty. So what I do think needs to happen is that as a sector, we have to have consensus that training is not enough. That in fact, fundamentally, when you're building any kind of ECD intervention, you have to start off with the question that it's going to be training plus what? So even if you can only afford a little bit of something else to that, let's say it's consecutive conversations that somebody can have with a practitioner to say, look, I'm trying to implement theory of change in my planning processes, but I'm having these kinds of challenges, that they're not stuck at their desk, not knowing how to apply this and feeling alone. They actually have somebody that's a mentor whom they can have conversations with, and that's all you can afford in the ECD intervention, but that's what's there. Others, which I think which would be much more valuable and which we've tested out now with young and emerging evaluators, is an immersion work program. And in fact, it's been so successful. We've actually done it with World Food Program, because we had, it came about from a conversation that we had to say, we're actually tired of these training programs that, young and emerging evaluators enter a training program and then, they left high and dry, they can't find work, they don't have experience. Okay, let's do something about this. So we had a program with World Food Program and the South African Monitoring and Evaluation Association, where we actually gave 6 young people training plus a work immersion experience. And some of them actually were then absorbed, almost within a couple of months, 6 months of the program or a year, because they got real experience and they could actually be part of evaluation teams. So I think it's consensus building that we must say it's training plus what, plus something. And then I think we need to become serious about investing in it. It's going to cost time. It's going to be money.
Thank you. I think that it was very interesting to listen to Sven's self-critical remarks, and then his confession that he's an optimist. Now, I am also an optimist, but I think that I am an evidence-based optimist, because we see evidence that things have changed. There's a lot of scope for improvement, but for example, the Global Evaluation Initiative, that's a remarkable advance. what was done before, because precisely it is a partnership between different agencies. And there's much more to it. But you asked also a very specific question to me. How can we proceed in a non-simplistic way? And I think that the key has to do with knowing the context. We are getting used too much to this question on what works. Sometimes it's added what works for whom today, but we have to be much more granular on that. We need to know the context. Sometimes it's not the case, but the nation is the unit. There are countries that are very heterogeneous. Costa Rica was mentioned here. Costa Rica, what works in the Atlantic area may not work in the Pacific and may not work in the Central Valley. And this is a rather small country. Not to say the case in India. What works in Andhra Pradesh may not work at all in Delhi or in Gujarat. There are different traditions, different cultures, different capacities. So in some cases, for example, we found that what was relevant for the indigenous people in Panama, the Guaymias, was something that was done in the Andhra Pradesh indigenous people in terms of cooperatives. Much more relevant than what was done in Panama City. That is completely relevant for this population. So sometimes it's not the country unit. In fact, this is one of the challenges for national evaluation systems. Perhaps on Friday, we are going to be discussing this. So the context is very important to know. And let me make one observation on training. I have a slight different approach to Candice. I think that the critical point in terms of how to move away is that perhaps we don't need to move away. It has to do with which are the critical constraints. It may be that training is a critical constraint, but it may be that training is not a critical constraint. So then you don't need training plus something. You need the plus, but not the training. In some other cases, training may be critical. So one has to develop a pragmatic approach. And again, here is where we have a lot of advance made in terms of all these structured ways on conducting diagnosis that can help for that purpose. So thank you.
Thank you. So there are those major two questions, the one about the trainings, and then Sven asked me if systems theory could be an entry point for ECD, and I try to answer both questions. How can we move, I'd say, beyond trainings, because I'm also convinced that trainings are important. And I come back to the example I just gave you. Well, when we are working with the national evaluation system and listen to their demands, not everyone will say, I want a training, we need a training, but they will have their own ideas. In our case, we made very good, we have a good experience with listen to other people. We developed a huge tool, the Index of National Evaluation Capacities, together with, I don't know, more than 30 actors from all over Latin America. And this was not our idea. Someone from the national evaluation, from an evaluation system had that idea. We developed that together with them. Or one of my major learnings was one session with a national evaluation system in Costa Rica. And we were discussing, so what do we need in Costa Rica? And people were talking about civil society, and civil society. And they wanted civil society to be engaged in evaluations. And we had no idea how to do that, but they had. So we said, okay, who do we need? Who are the best people for us to work with from civil society, and besides the National Ombudsman, to tell us how to integrate civil society into national evaluations. So we learned from them, and that worked pretty good. And of course, this integration of civil society into evaluation also meant that we did give trainings. So it was training, but it was so much more. And we would never have known how to do that without working with the people who are experts on their own national evaluation system. So this is also perhaps the answer to Sven's question. Can systems theory be the entry point for ECD always? I wish I could say yes, yeah, give me time, give me money, I can do that. But it's difficult for me as an ECD practitioner. I have to plan 2 years ECD projects. I can't write in the document, dear German government, I will first of all sit with the national evaluation system representatives. They will tell me what to do. You will give the money. And then after 2 years, I come back to you. No. So we often don't have the flexibility. We don't have the time, and time is often money to do so. But what we can do is reflecting on this systems theory or crowning ECD and systems theory for our ECD projects.
Colleagues, the floor is open. You were the quickest. And we'll take 3 questions and then we'll get responses from, please. And as we did before, please give us your name and where you're from as you start.
Thank you. Peter S. Dolo. I'm from Liberia. And thank you to our panelists. I have 2 quick questions, and I'll be taking cue from Cadence and Sarah from the presentation. The first one is about training unit that she mentioned. And I'd like to add 1 word rather than just say national evaluation capacities. My concern is how can we have sustainable national evaluation capacities? In other words, how can we have a buy-in from national government that we can have a resource stream through a budget allocation, for example, to help a nation make its evaluation capacity, sustainable? That's 1. The second one, I'm from the civil society side, from Liberia, and I was interested when I heard Sarah talk about civil society being part of the complementarity. Now the question comes to me, what role can civil society play? With my own experience by home, government versus civil society, what role, can civil society play that government can see that CSO is a partner to the NEC process? Those are just my concern.
Thank you.
Je vais parler en français. Alors, je m'appelle Abdeslam Nada, je suis directeur de la planification au commissariat au plan au Royaume du Maroc. Je suis chargé de l'élaboration du rapport national sur les objectifs de développement durable. Et donc, à ce moment-là, je vous remercie d'abord pour l'effort et la réussite de des présentations. Je suis intéressé par l'expérience allemande en matière de suivi-évaluation, de système de suivi-évaluation, et en appliquant ces concepts de système. Ça veut dire, je veux bien savoir, le système allemand en suivi-évaluation, quelles sont ses composantes, quelle complémentarité entre ces composantes, quelle était l'entrée de construction de ce système, et surtout, quelle réorientation avez-vous donné à votre système pour qu'il puisse être efficace en matière d'évaluation, de réalisation des objectifs de développement durable? Merci.
Ada Ocampo, President of the Global Network IDEAS. Thanks very much to all the panelists and presenters. This was very interesting. In my many years of experience working on ECD, national evaluation systems, partnerships, and other, I learned, among other things, the importance of language and the importance on the way we communicate, we train, we interact with other stakeholders, especially those that are not evaluators. Having said that, I must confess that I was a bit concerned to hear in that evaluation might be the worst instrument of imperialism and blah, 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 blah. I think those kind of reflections are important, but the language, although albeit impactful, might also be polarizing. So I think we have to be careful. We tend to repeat what is impactful, but I get scared about that because I don't know whether we are going to actually help with that in ECD, making ECD work, building national evaluation systems that are more resilient and more effective. We need to have languages that are more inclusive, that bring together different stakeholders, and that can have global effects for evaluation to work better. That's my humble opinion, and I hope this is not implying that the work that Africa is doing in decolonizing evaluation is not good. It is good, but I think it shouldn't be polarizing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that response, and nice to have this engagement. That's what we're here for, right? We'll ask the panel just to make a few responses to the first three questions, and then we'll take one more round. I know we're a little bit late. Please indulge us because I think it's very important to have these discussions. Why don't we start in the same rotation? So Candice, if you'd like to respond first, and then Osvaldo, and then we'll move to Sarah and Sven.
Okay. Thank you very much. And just to start with the last one, thank you very much, Ada. I completely agree with you. I am also a collaborator. I have a collaborative nature. And I also don't believe in antagonism and polarizing, action. But I do think that there are some conversations that have been hidden for a long time, and in the microcosm sometimes of how it feels for those who are on the receiving end of aid or donor assistance, those power asymmetries, they actually manifest in the microcosm of how somebody feels they were treated, or feels like they are the imperialism or the power differentials are manifesting in how they are treated. So certainly I think that there must be space and room for people to be able to say it and name it, but definitely not. What we have to do then is to say, and that's on the last slide that I didn't get to, is to say how important partnerships are. So co-creating is one of the ways in which Clear AA has actually managed our relationship with the country partners that we work with, that it's not even, we could even be imperialistic on our own continent. So there's the notion that, oh, you're coming from Johannesburg, South Africa, you're coming into Malawi, you're coming to tell us how fantastic South African system is, and now we have to copy yours. So we've completely done away with that kind of perspective and said, can we meet you at where your particular need is? We can show you what we've done in South Africa, and we can share with you what the African government has done, but we need to walk alongside you in your journey. So I actually do agree with Ada in how we need to proceed going forward. And then just very, very quickly on the training, only from the colleague from Liberia. I think local academic institutions need to be far more involved in shaping and understanding what the ECD environment requires, so that we build local competencies to sustain the ECD, because a lot of people are doing postgraduate diplomas in M&E and so forth, but the institutions are not really teaching what is needed in practice. I think academic institutions need to be brought on board. VOPEs, which is voluntary organizations for professional evaluation, need to be part of the kind of shifting to sustaining local ECD interventions, and then a whole lot of advocacy, because it doesn't help to just kind of say that government must invest more in capacity development. You actually have to build a shift in paradigms and thinking that it is actually valuable to invest in that. Thank you.
Indeed, the comments were not addressed to the points that I mentioned, but anyway, on Ada's point, I think that the answer to arrogance should not be arrogance. And I echo what Ada said, because it seemed a bit arrogant, the statement. Second, on the issue about training, I agree with what Candy said, but I would add another point, and it's to involve the universities and local institutions, think tanks, in some kind of research on these issues, so that then their training can be based on the findings of their research and made it much more relevant. Thank you. And the German system.
Oui, merci monsieur pour votre question. Je vais vous répondre en anglais. Because the German system is quite complex. And it would take me an hour to at least sketch it out roughly adequately. But I think for this audience here, 2 points. One is where I don't think Germany is an example to be followed, which is looking domestically at its evaluation system, because within Germany, looking at domestic policies, many ministries have evaluation functions. Not all of them have them. It's scattered. The capacities vary. Some are very good in labor market. In other areas, they're less so. And I think there are actually a couple of countries, South Africa, Costa Rica, were much more advanced in terms of national evaluation systems. So looking this domestically, I would say, maybe look at other countries as interesting experiences. However, where I do think, and obviously I have to say that, coming from Deval, is where I do think Germany is an interesting case is in international development cooperation, because 10 years ago, the Ministry of Development Cooperation decided to establish an independent institute, Deval, with the mandate to evaluate in Germany's ODA spending. Sorry, and we've been growing over the past 10 years. We're an independent but government funded institute. All our reports are public, and if you listen to Sarah or some other colleagues, not to me, you will notice that there are some very capable people in the institution. So I think that element is actually quite something interesting to have that separate institution. However, which was needed because the system is so complex. So many of you know GIZ or KfW. They all have their own evaluation functions. We sit sort of on top, and we do also meta evaluation syntheses, because the system underneath this is quite complex. So in that sense, and so the reform of the DAC criteria actually helped us also. We were active partners in that, and we translated the new criteria into guidelines from the ministry that are streamlined. So I think that's in the last 2-3 years, the reform of the DAC criteria for us was some important step forward. I'll stop there and we can talk longer.
So you asked what role can civil society play in evaluation, in a national evaluation system? And I don't have the answer, because each national evaluation system is different. So what's true for Costa Rica is not true for Liberia, is not true for Germany. However, I do think I have some clues. Civil society represents, most cases, those people who are supposed to benefit from whatever the government is doing. So civil society could play a major role in the planning of evaluations, telling the government what to evaluate, how to evaluate, helping with the formulation of evaluation questions. This is what happens in Costa Rica, for example. Then another possibility for civil society would be to be integrated in evaluations, doing participatory evaluations of national policies or national programs. What we did in Costa Rica and also with the government of Jalisco is implementing evaluations with civil society engagement. So those who are the beneficiaries of the program to be evaluated were also part of the evaluation, which is also how civil society can be integrated in evaluation. And then, of course, evaluation results should always be discussed by civil society with civil society actors. And I think this is true for each and every country.
Colleagues, I have been told by my team in the past that when you get enthusiastic, Alan, sometimes time gets elastic. And then they write me these little notes to say, Alan, please remember that there is a next session at 3:45, and this group will probably want to have a break beforehand. So I had promised another round of questions, but if so, I will be in conflict with other interests and demands of this team. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to wrap up here. Please, can we give a round of applause to our team? Thank you all for joining us in this session.